restless. It couldn't have been long, or at least that was Jeremiah's best guess. The fact that he was still alive was a clear indication of that. Blackness, nothing but dense darkness surrounded him. He tried to maneuver, but the space was limited. In fact, he was barely able to separate his arms from his body. Lifting his hand, he jammed his thumb on the roof, which was only inches above him. Several times he banged on the roof as hard as he could, the stiff sound of his strikes unable to resonate through the uncertain surface that lay on top of him. He inspected himself up and down, a suit, a tie, and even his yukama. It all started to sink in, albeit as hard a notion it was to comprehend. Hyperventilating, the sound of his breathing brushed along the walls of his congested quarter. He tried desperately to remember what he could. Where he was before this. How did this happen? Why couldn't he remember anything? All these questions and more raced through his mind, but none as terrifying as the most apparent fact. He was buried alive. Jeremiah let out several bellows, screaming in short bursts as he could feel the air beginning to deplete in quality, the smell and taste of his expended breaths beginning to take its place. He knew he had only a few minutes, or less, accounting for the amount of time he'd been here already. He continued his attempts to desperately claw his way through the roof, but did nothing but bruise his fingers as they now began to bleed. He could feel the dampness of his blood within the padded lining of the roof. Jeremiah ripped and clawed at the padding, trying to give himself a sense of progress in his escape. From the corner he managed to separate a piece of fabric with his thumb and forefinger, tearing it from the seam. Jeremiah did his best to feel out the edges and, taking a firm grip of the exposed lining, pulled with what strength and leverage he could muster. He managed to pull away a large section of fabric of about 2 square feet. Though he couldn't see anything, the feeling of making headway, as well as the solid surface, was motivating. He patted the slab of wood above him, trying to hear any semblance of an echo, a vibration of any kind that would give him a sense of hope. His blows, however hard, fell flat, but Jeremiah pounded until his muscles were numb, crying and laughing in a growing uncontrollable hysteria. All he could think of was how he could have ended up here. Amongst the tears and the sharp breaths, he tried his best to imagine how and why someone could have made such a mistake. Did they think he was dead? Why? What had happened? What was the last thing he could remember? Nothing. There was nothing he could recall. He never really did anything out of the ordinary. His routine was pretty standard. He only had 2 friends he could speak of, or at least those he would go out of his way to spend time with. His best friend Dan, who he spoke to on and off during the week and would drop by his house every so often. When did I talk to him last? It was, God, when was it? Thursday, Friday? He thought back. As best he could remember, he hadn't heard from Dan in days, probably due to the obvious circumstance. What about Trish? He thought. Surely she must realize he's not around. Jeremiah kept in better contact with her. They had a much longer history and were a pair that could share more intimate details. Whatever the reason for this, he was sure Trish had to know of it in some manner. There were nights upon nights when Jeremiah couldn't sleep that he would be able to call her and talk for however long until, I never could sleep, he began to recall. Jeremiah suffered from chronic insomnia, only able to sleep a few hours a night if at all. There were times where he even went on 2 or 3 days without a wink. By the 3rd day his delirium and disorientation were in full swing. However, that following night's sleep was never sounder for him, but the years of such a condition had really taken its toll. There was something. He thought, the drug trials. It was starting to come back. He had visited the hospital recently for yet another complaint about a string of sleepless nights. With his prescription filled, Jeremiah left for home. Once there, he sat at his computer to turn off his brain for a while. A few hours of web browsing often helped aid in his sleeplessness. This night he had received an email about a new drug that was being put into human trials, a long-term treatment for insomnia, At this point he was willing to try anything. While typical sleeping pills managed to take the edge off for a while, Jeremiah was in the market for something sustainable, something he could rely on. While the list of side effects were typical: headaches, muscle weakness and stiffness, joint pain and such, it was a fair gamble. Nowhere on that list, however, did it mention being buried alive. Still, he could only wonder how it came to this. The trial. I had taken the meds, and the congestion continued to weigh on Jeremiah, almost as if he could feel the pressure of the earth suffocating him. He tried desperately to shorten his breathing to prolong his life as much as he could. Continuously, he would tap the far end of the coffin with his toe to give himself a readable dimension of his spacing. There wasn't much to go on, nothing had changed, but the continuous inspection gave him something to focus on. When he had regained some strength in his arms, he continued to feel around the torn area and ripped away more of the fabric.